Okay, this lecture is going to be in the time period of 1814 to about 1830s, 1837-ish. It's a time period where you're going to see huge expansion, and you're going to see huge expansion of the cotton crop, huge expansion of industry, and then you're also going to just see changes in society in this period of time. Okay, so I want to start out in the South, and I want to address the South because there's going to be a huge expansion of the cotton crop. You're going to have this really sturdy cotton plant that's going to really take hold in kind of like the deep South, and it's just going, the amount of cotton is just going to explode. But with that, you're also going to see a huge amount of slavery that is going to be needed because of the cotton crop. So you're going to see a huge expansion of slavery. Okay, now when you are doing the farming, for the cotton. That cotton is going to be taken and it's going to be taken and brought up north where it's going to be processed in textile factories. Textile factories is a factory that makes anything of cloth. And so that's where you're going to see a huge industrial expansion in the north. Okay, and I'm going to get to that in a little bit. Okay, so when you talk about slaves in the South, once again, just huge expansion of slavery all over the South. And when you talk about field hands, women are going to do basically almost everything a man is going to do in the fields. I have a quote, I don't have the name of the slave, but I have a quote from a female slave that says, "I have done everything on a farm of what a man has done except cut weed." When you cut wheat and you bale it, it's really heavy, and I'm believing it's kind of like the upper body strength of a woman. But when you talk about cotton and the cotton crops, women are going to be doing every aspect of the farming. Okay, so having said that, okay, you're also going to have women who are slaves that are more household slaves, and you will see them doing everything and anything. I've kind of already mentioned it. I'll just kind of go over briefly. When you see women working in the homes, they're basically doing everything and anything that is needed. Cooking, cleaning, sewing, butchering, kind of preparing the meats. Being a midwife, there is a record of a 13-year-old girl that was trained as a midwife, and her master basically was paid for her services as a midwife. So they were doing all different types of things, and they could also have really great skills because they're constantly doing something and become very good at it. Because of that, sometimes women would try to make extra money, especially like on Sundays. Sunday can be a little bit quieter of a day, and sometimes they would work on Sunday making extra food, doing more sewing, and then selling whatever they produced. Or when you talk about sewing, they might be doing like mending for a different family and basically getting money for it. And the idea is that if you get money, the idea is hopefully eventually you would buy your children out of freedom, or you would buy yourself out of freedom. As I think I already mentioned before, with slavery came a huge amount of abuse, a huge amount of beatings, rape, lack of food, lack of basic service or basic rights. Obviously education, they weren't allowed to be educated at all. With the realm of abuse, you have female slaves that can definitely find themselves pregnant, all depending on what, it is all a huge personal decision of what happens with that pregnancy. There were actually some women that actually did not want to actually have children, and so they would try to have like some type of an abortion. It's usually herbal abortion. Very rarely, there's a few documented cases of infant suicides just because they didn't want their children to become slaves. Once again, an extremely personal decision. Usually the children, basically they had the children and the children became slaves themselves. Okay, another situation. As I mentioned before, you could definitely have slaves that would run away. They could run away on their own, or they would use the institution of the Underground Railroad, which was an organized system started up in the north. They would send conductors down into the south that would help get slaves from the south into the north. It didn't matter how a slave ran away if they were caught. It all depends on the master. It might be a severe beating. It might be like extra work for an extreme long period of time, or it could actually be death. And so it just kind of all depended on the master and how the master reacted. Another thing I think I mentioned briefly, marriage. Some masters agreed with it, some masters did not. And some would say, yeah, I'll let you have like a little bit of a, what I would refer to as a formal ceremony of it. Some did not. And so they created their own ceremony, and a very popular one was the couple would hold hands and jump over a broomstick at the same time, and that would signify their marriage. And so within these kinship networks, they really created a culture, a slave culture unto its own, to celebrate and mark events and, in a sense, create a life within slavery. And they really developed this culture, the slave culture, onto its own. And then also with the network, the kinship networks, you have just this support and of supporting one another in good times, but also in bad times, and coming together as a community and truly creating that community. Another thing that can be a part of that, it would be song and music. Song and music was extremely important and very extensive within the slave community. Songs usually had something to do with religion. They were usually religious songs. And it was usually about talking about like kind of an afterlife and trying to get through this life and trying to get to that promised land and that promised life, that afterlife. Also, when you talk about music, when they first come over, when slaves first come over, they bring the African drum beat, and that will definitely be incorporated into their music. But then there's a huge blending of music, because then you'll start to see slaves that will have guitars and banjos and fiddles, and they have this definitely blended type of music, and kind of in a sense a new form of music. And then that music will eventually move into basically the beginnings of jazz music and blues music. And so definitely, I mean, you really see this really extensive culture, if you will, that will grow out of the slave community. Okay, now I want to talk about another community, if you will, and this is in the South also. This would be the free Black community in the South. As I mentioned, you're going to have, or the two I'm going to talk about is South Carolina and Louisiana. In South Carolina, you're going to have a predominant free Black community in Charleston, South Carolina. It's right on the edge of the city, and you have it growing in number. I actually don't have like an actual number population-wise, but it has expanded over the years. You have more people getting their freedom, buying their freedom, being given their freedom, running away, and just becoming a part of a free Black community. And this free Black community will get to a point where it will actually have businesses, and obviously they do business within themselves, but they do business, and you will actually have some small percentage that will actually be considered middle class. And so that's a huge movement for them. And they have enough business that they really can kind of take care of their own and really be self-sufficient. Now, New Orleans. New Orleans will also have a very large free Black community, once again on the edge of New Orleans. But once again, they're going to create small businesses, and it's basically this self-contained little community, or not even little, because New Orleans was actually fairly large. And they have this self-contained where they have small businesses, and they're able to make money, actually decent money, and be able to be self-sufficient. You will actually, once again, have African Americans that will move up to middle class, kind of verging on the edge of middle wealthy class. One woman, I don't have the actual business that she was in, but Euphrosina Hinyard is actually going to be a business owner, and she will do quite well, and she was considered to be middle class. Another woman, Marie Coravent. Marie Coravent will gain her freedom. She'll be in the New Orleans, move into the New Orleans area, be a part of the free black community. She will marry her husband, and then she and her husband will own several businesses within that community. And they were considered upper middle class, probably verging on wealthy. The Hinyards are going to, the Coravent, the Coravents are going to open up a school for orphan children. And this is going to be in 1837 when they open up a school. This is right on the outskirts of New Orleans. This school will eventually become what's known as the Holy Redeemer School. The Holy Redeemer School is still functioning today, and it is the oldest Black Catholic school in the United States. It was not a Catholic school when they owned it, when they ran it. It was just a school for orphan Blacks. But then it was then incorporated by the Catholic Church, and it will become Holy Redeemer. And as I mentioned, it is the oldest Black Catholic church, or oldest Black Catholic school in the United States. And that was actually started by the Coravents. Okay, moving on in society within the South, talking about kind of the white community in the South. The white community in the South ranged, it had a huge range. It had the extreme poor to the extreme wealthy. So they have a very large economic span. Overall, women, it doesn't matter if you're poor or whether you're wealthy. You're basically taking care of the family household, you're taking care of the children, and also making sure that the children, the family go to church. Okay, so when you talk about the poor, and you can have extreme poor in the South. And usually the extreme poor, well, you can do both, but usually the extreme poor are associated with farming, and they have really poor farming. They have really poor land to farm, and they can't get out of it. It's usually very small in size, and it's just nutrient-wise, it's just really poor land, and therefore their crops are not going to be very good. They're not going to be able to get much money. And then you get into this really nasty cycle. Okay. Another thing is that they could be farming land that they actually don't even own. And they're basically having to pay rent and pay for supplies to the owner, which totally is going to put them into debt that they can't get out of. And you just have this really nasty a cycle of poverty. You will also see poor whites that will just be laborers, that either they can't even farm, or they're not associated with farming. They don't have the education, and they just basically take really low labor jobs. So when you talk about this poor class, as I had slightly mentioned, their education is truly going to be lacking. They're going to have a very, very basic education. It's usually education that they have picked up from their family, which isn't great to begin with. And very rarely do you see them in school because the children have to work for the family to survive. Usually they know their numbers, they might be able to do a little bit of adding, and some very basic literacy. With this economic group, their diet is usually poor. You're going to see a huge incidence of disease, and then with the disease is definitely going to come death. So it's definitely a struggle, a struggle in life. When you talk about the next class I'm going to talk about is what's known as the yeoman farmer. The yeoman farmer tends to be kind of that middle class farmer, can be on the edging of low middle class, maybe on the edge of high middle class. But the yeoman farmer, I would say, is kind of like your average farmer in the South and would make up the majority of the population in the South. The yeoman farmer would have a farm that's decent in size, not extremely large. The land that they have is, I would say, decent land, meaning nutrient wise, that they can have a decent crop. But it's not going to be the absolute best land, meaning nutrient wise. And it's really hard for them to expand because they usually don't have, they usually have a little bit extra money, but not enough money to actually expand their farm. And so once again, they kind of get caught up in the sense that it's really hard to get out of their middle class or even lower middle class existence. They just kind of are in their economic class. They are also, with their children, or they themselves and their children will have more education. I would say for boys, definitely high school or parts of high school. The daughters, I would say up to junior high. Junior high is usually kind of a cutoff for education for girls because when you get into what we know as like junior high or middle school for us, that is when you've got to start teaching the girls on how to be potential wives and mothers, and you need to teach them how to cook and how to sew and how to run a household. You need to start focusing on having girls meet boys, so potential mates. And so that's really the focus for young girls at this point in time. So education wise, you usually tend to see the education kind of stop, kind of slack off, kind of around what we know is like middle school today. Now, one of the hopes and dreams of that yeoman farmer or yeoman class is that their daughters are going to marry up, that their daughters are going to marry some guy that is high middle class or kind of like on the edge of wealthy, or definitely wealthy, and you want your daughters to do that because obviously then that they would get a better life just overall, but then the family would see that might translate to the family themselves, and there would be a little bit more money coming in or given to the daughter's family. So they see it as a very positive thing for daughters and families. Now, does that always happen? No, I would say that's an exception more than a rule. Does it happen? Yes. Does it happen all the time? No. The rule really is, especially in the South, is that you meet the person of your economic status, because that's who you hang around with. That's who you're going to be seeing in society. And that's usually what happens. And especially in the South in this time period, you tend to stay in your economic strata. Also, it's actually easier you can always fall out of your economic strata, but it's always very difficult to move up the economic strata. Okay, when you're talking poor and yeoman class, middle class, family size tends to be large. They need kids to work the farms or to bring in money for the family, so they tend to be on the large side. Women definitely have a huge responsibility because they're cooking, they're cleaning, they're doing the spinning and the weaving and the sewing of clothes. They're doing childcare. They're trying to get some type of education for their kids, especially when they're little. And then chances are they're helping their husbands. They're helping their husbands in the field or with a business or maybe working a little bit themselves. So the workload for poor and middle class women is definitely very high or very heavy. Now, religion. Religion is a very major element of life in the South, and it does not matter if you're poor or you're wealthy. The South tended to be very religious. At this point in time, the Baptist and Methodist churches tend to be the predominant churches in the South, and it was really the woman's responsibility to get the family in church and make sure the kids are church going and knowing the Bible and knowing the Bible stories, that type of thing. And it doesn't matter if you're poor or you're wealthy. That is definitely the woman's responsibility. Now, when you talk about the Baptist and Methodist churches, they tend to allow women to participate a little bit more in various ways. It's not like they're going to give the sermon or anything, but they tend to participate a little bit more within the church. And that can be a good thing for women because it kind of gives them self-importance and self-worth, and you feel like you're a part of the church, you feel like you're part of a community, that type of thing. So that can actually be a very positive thing, seen as a very positive thing for women. Okay, now, elite women or wealthy women in the South. Most women who are wealthy were born wealthy and they marry into that strata. Usually you marry this in the strata that you're in. And then they usually stay there. They are referred to as lady by anybody in society. So if they came across a poor person, they would refer to the woman as lady. Even like middle class would refer to the woman as lady. Education. This could definitely, the woman is going to have education. She might have the education up to what we know as junior high, middle school. She might even have education up to high school. And some might even have education of what we would refer to as some like college education. And that might be, she's not going to college, but she's basically doing like private tutoring that would kind of get her into that level. Kind of all dependent on the family. Some are going to stop education for women, like I said, around middle school time period because she needs to focus on other things. She needs to know how to cook and how to sew and how to manage a household. And she needs to start doing a lot of social things so she can meet her prospective mate and really kind of train her on how to be a wife and a mother, all those things. So kind of all depends. Family size for the wealthy, I would say is a little bit less, but still a good sized family. I would probably say like maybe 4 kids-ish at this point in time. That was kind of considered to be a little bit less, but good sized family at that point in time. Okay, another thing that your wealthy women would be in charge of is maintaining the household, obviously, but she's maintaining it differently. She's kind of like the overseer of what's going on in the household, meaning she is overseeing the slaves in the household. She's also she might be keeping the like bookkeeping or the accounting for the household needs within the house. Now, when you talk about overseeing the slaves, it all depends on the person. Complete depends on the person. You might have a woman who is, very particular about everything, wants everything to be perfect, and she's always on top of her slaves to do this, do that, do this, did you do this? And she's kind of like always in their face. You could also then get a woman who's, I would say, a little bit more laid back of saying, hey, you need to do A, B, and C and get it done. And she's not like really always on top of them. So it just kind of all depended on the personality. If you get a person who is basically micromanaging everything and in the slave's face, it's kind of really difficult for the slaves because you can't really get away from the people in the household because they're always near some way, shape, or form. So that can always be challenging. Once again, as I mentioned, religion is very important. Wealthy women would definitely be there to make sure the family and the kids went to church. The elite women would also be very concerned with social events. They would be organizing social events of where the parents might be going to some social function or the entire family would going to a social function. They themselves would probably be throwing parties. So that was a very important aspect of the wealthy's life in the South. And that would definitely be the woman's responsibility. As I also mentioned before, divorce, very, very few and very uncommon for divorce to happen in the South. Once you get married, you're definitely married. And it was very hard for women to get a divorce in the South. It would really have to be like an extreme case of abuse for divorce to be granted in the South. And there's definitely this view in the South that you have roles in the South. Men are caretakers and women are the ones being taken care of. And they know their place in society and people don't disrupt those places. And that's another thing. You don't disrupt the place that you're in. It's just kind of like a given. Okay, now I'm going to move away from the South and move into the North. Okay, when you talk about the North, slavery has really died out. It really died out with the Revolutionary War. Most states had gotten rid of it with the Revolutionary War, or like right after the Revolutionary War. Slavery was just really ineffective because they didn't really need a huge amount of slaves. And it just, at the end of the day, it died out. There was also some moral implications where you have people really thinking about the moral aspects of it. And so you see slavery abolished, and it's definitely not in the South. So you definitely have this free African American community that's in the North. When you talk about the free African American women, approximately 2/3 of the African American women in the North worked as domestic servants, doing some type of domestic servant work. It could be an overall general domestic servant, or they were doing snowing, or they were doing laundry, or they were cooks. But overall, that was the majority of the employment. The wages are definitely low. It doesn't matter what an African American, male or female, is doing. It's going to be low. But it's the fact that they're not in slavery, and they're trying to, in a sense, kind of be incorporated into society. But they're definitely still taking low-paying jobs and kind of the labor position jobs. They don't have any rights, and so that's another whole aspect. I mean, they're free, but they don't have any rights, so they're not fully integrated into society. What you will see is you'll see community organizations being developed within the African American community. They'll create their own organizations. Sometimes they're associated with church or religious organizations, or you'll see women creating their own organizations, and you'll see that throughout the South. Education is emphasized. It has always been emphasized. Once they got their freedom, education was emphasized, and it was about educating themselves, even if it was just basic literacy, but always really focused on their children, to get their children educated, and that really focused also on women, to get women, the girls, the women educated. So you will then start to see, as the years go by, this far more literate population of the African Americans. And you will also start to see some African Americans in the North start to move into middle class. I would say it's more of an exception than the norm, but you will definitely see African Americans moving into middle class. It definitely helps with education, but it might also be a skill that they have. They might be a really great, they might be able to run a business. They might have like an upholstery business that takes them to middle class, or you might be doing more like accounting or bookkeeping, that type of thing with education. They are definitely very religious. They will be going, religion is definitely very important to them. You'll see them being involved in churches and religious communities and religious organizations. For an example, you have the Colored Female Religious and Moral Reform Society of Salem, Massachusetts. It's a long name, but it kind of gives you an example. So one more time. The Colored Females Religious and Moral Reform Society of Salem, Massachusetts. Other examples, you also have the Daughters of Africa in Philadelphia. You will also have what's referred to as mutual aid societies. Mutual aid societies will be all over the North. One example I had is in Philadelphia, but mutual aid societies, African American mutual aid societies, will be all over the North. They're there to help the poor, and in their case, the poor African Americans. Another one, you have the Minerva Literacy Association in Philadelphia, just an organization, a social organization for women. Churches are going to offer a lot of opportunities. It offers just community. It offers them to be involved in something. You can then have like organizations and associations associated with churches. But you also see them, especially with the Methodist and Baptist churches that you will see up north, you'll see women to be encouraged to be part of prayer meetings and run prayer meetings and do like Bible readings. And so once again, you see them very playing a role within that church. And once again, it gives you self-worth, it gives you self-importance, and you really feel like you're a part of something. Other organizations that they'll be fighting for is civil rights. You'll see also the right for education and to promote education and more education for the African American community. You will also then see the growth of the anti-slavery abolitionist movement. This is going to be growing in the United States, predominantly in the North. And it's both African American and white that will be a part of the anti-slavery abolitionist movement. But you'll definitely see African Americans being a part of it. Now, I want to make a note on the anti-slavery abolitionist movement. Both of them want the same thing. They want the outcome to be the same, and that's the end of slavery. Anti-slavery people, or who are part of anti-slavery organizations, they tend to be okay with taking a step by step approach to end slavery, and they're okay with that. Like, if we can fight it for this and get one law passed, and then we can move on to this and then get another law passed, so long as the ultimate end goal is to end slavery. Okay, so that's anti-slavery. The abolitionists, they want the end of slavery, but they say make one law, end slavery, and do it today. And for them, there's no other way in their mind. And so both organizations and both movements want the same thing, but it's the way they want to go about it is going to be different. Okay, an example is going to be Maria Stewart. Maria Stewart was born 1831 of free parents, so she and her family have always been free. She was orphaned as a child. She worked as a servant to basically support herself, and then she will marry, and she will actually then become educated. As an adult, she is going to work for the abolitionist cause. She will write and lecture for the abolitionist cause. Another woman, Sarah Mapps Douglas. Sarah Mapps Douglas, 1832. She is a free woman in Philadelphia, African-American woman in Philadelphia. And she was basically a political advocate for the African-American community, and she will run a free school for African-American children. So she herself is educated if she's going to be able to create a school and then run a school. Another woman, Sarah Louisa Fortin. Sarah Louisa Fortin. The Fortin family is a free African-American family. 1833, she wrote for the newspaper, it's called The Liberator. And she'll write for The Liberator along with her sister, Sarah Mapps Douglas. And then she will also write for the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society. Now, The Liberator, I want to talk about The Liberator as a newspaper. It's referred to as an anti-slavery paper. It's a little bit of a misnomer because The Liberator is an abolitionist newspaper. It's created by William Lloyd Garrison, and he is a diehard abolitionist. And The Liberator is going to be a very popular, probably one of the most popular newspapers for the abolitionist movement. And you have a woman, Sarah Louisa Fortin, that is going to be writing for The Liberator. And I want to clarify something because the way I lectured it, the way I spoke it, I don't think it made sense. So I want to go back to it. Sarah Louisa Fortin, 1833, wrote for The Liberator along with her sisters, period. Okay, and she also worked alongside Sarah Mapps Douglas. Okay, so I don't want you to think that Sarah Mapps Douglas was Sarah Fortin's sister. Okay, so Sarah Fortin and her sisters wrote for The Liberator. Also, Sarah Mapps Douglas will also be writing or a contributor to the Liberator, and they will also all be involved in the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society. Okay, I am going to stop there for this lecture, and I will pick up on another video. And the next video, I believe we're going to get into labor and industry.